Welcome to Calgary Talks, the social series. I have a chance to talk to great Calgarians on a regular basis, and this series is welcoming you into all of those conversations. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Calgary Talks, the social series. I'm really pleased today that we have our special guest, Duane Bratt, who is a professor of political science at Mount Royal University, and he's a very well-known political commentator as well as a researcher. We are going to be discussing the upcoming Alberta provincial budget and the potential impact that it's going to have on Calgary. So we'll focus on things like key financial decisions, external pressures that are going to shape this budget, and what it means for us as municipalities. So welcome, Duane.
I'm happy to be here.
Duane, let's start off with the provincial budget and the impact it'll have on Calgary. And let me ask you, based on what we know so far, what decisions do you think will come out of this budget that Calgarians will feel the most?
It's going to be an ugly budget. I think first step is that promised tax cut is going to be delayed once again. We're probably going into deficit. The effects of the tariffs may not have impacted yet, but the threat is going to be hanging over. And as a result, that is going to have a drop in the price of oil. And so much of the budget is based on the price of oil. So I expect that there will be a deficit, there will be a delay in the tax cut, and there will be cuts. So then the question is, where are those cuts going to be? I don't think she is going to touch healthcare or education. Those are the top two spending items. So then the question is, where else is it going to be? It will be in advanced education, because that's number 3. And quite frankly, unless you're a student or a parent of a student or a faculty member, no one cares. And then it will be on municipality grants. Because I believe that is number 4. And once again, that is a nice hidden cut, because the impact will be felt by Calgarians, it'll be felt by Edmontonians and people in Red Deer and Lethbridge and all other municipalities, but the focus won't be on the provincial government. The focus will be on the municipal government when those cuts occur, which is really good politics, bad policy for the provincial government to do that. You and Mayor Sohi and the others will all complain, but you complain after every budget, and so that will be able to be ignored. So I expect that there will be cuts to the municipal grant.
So it's your feeling that we're going to see more offloading onto municipalities?
Absolutely.
Less funding,
more responsibility, but without any power.
So what do you think municipalities are going to need to do into the future, given that responsibilities are offloaded to us and funding doesn't come?
You're in a very, very difficult situation, because constitutionally, you really have no authority. You're at the mercy of the provincial government. Now, this is not the first provincial government to have disputes with the big cities. I moved back to Alberta in the early 90s. I grew up in the 70s. This is a frequent issue, and it doesn't matter who is in the office. And it's because there's inherent tensions between the provincial government and particularly the big cities. And that is not going to go away anytime soon. The difference is this government is actually taking action on that and using the powers and authorities that they have to really damage municipalities. So they want to make sure that you have the responsibilities, but don't have the power or the financial wherewithal to do it. So you have to keep going back to the provincial government for those financial resources, and they're going to put conditions on it. And there is so a veto point, not an operational point, but a veto point. And that is a bit more unique than what we've seen.
So tell me, in your perspective, what do they stand to gain by crippling major municipalities?
Well, you're seen as a counter power center, right? Because you have an elected mandate, just as the other big city of Edmonton has an electoral mandate. So it's a counterweight. It's a legitimate counterweight. Having a bunch of small rural towns, that's one thing, but when you're a city of 1.4 million people, that's a pretty powerful form of legitimacy, and they want to gradually erode that. This is not unique, by the way, to Alberta. We have seen this in other provinces as well, where there is often fights between the provincial government and the municipal government. You look at the actions of Doug Ford in Ontario, who I think really would prefer to be Mayor of Toronto than Premier of Ontario, and he's taken extraordinary steps to interfere into Toronto politics during the emergencies and the Ottawa convoy, I don't even think he realized Ottawa, which is about the size of Calgary, was part of Ontario. Right. And so this is not unique, but the efforts that the current government has taken through Bills 18 and 20 are much more extraordinary. And so that's one element. The other element, though, is the current electoral calculation of the provincial government, which is only in office because of voters outside of the two major cities, right? They didn't win a single seat in Edmonton. They lost the majority of seats in Calgary. So picking on Calgary and Edmonton is good politics in the rest of the province.
And
so
as you
there's
said,
an element of that.
Bad policy.
It's bad policy, absolutely. But it allows them to pull strings, but not take responsibility for it, right? They don't want to actually take operational, because then if garbage isn't collected or there's a problem with the LRT, then they're going to take the blame. Instead, the blame goes on to the municipal government.
And we've seen that with the Green Line LRT project. We've been dictated a solution.
Yeah, and not just the Green Line, a bunch of other elements as well. You look at the arena deal and look at the timing of that arena deal. Same thing with the LRT. The LRT is a greater thing, but I've often made this distinction between the hockey rink and the LRT, is that people from Innisfail or Tabor will come to Calgary to go to a concert. They will come to Calgary for a Flames game. They are not going to come to Calgary to sit on the C train. And so why put money into the C train?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about external forces on the budget, and let's look at the situation we find ourselves in right now with potential tariffs coming.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk federally about a Team Canada approach. At this point in time, wouldn't you think the Alberta government would at the very least want a Team Alberta approach and support its municipalities?
We're not seeing a full Team Canada approach, and probably the best illustration of this was last Wednesday. All the premiers met in Washington for the first time on a foreign visit. They have done foreign visits before, but with the federal government. Okay, so this was planned back in January. They go down there, they hire a GR firm, and they get a meeting with the deputy chief of staff. Not a very high level position. Meanwhile, on that same day, the Minister of Finance with the Canadian ambassador is meeting with the Secretary of Commerce. Secretary of Commerce is the person in charge of trade, right? That to have two separate meetings simultaneously, who is speaking for Canada? Right? That is a problem. So then you get, and we do know that of the premiers, Danielle Smith is the least offside of the rest of Team Canada. She was on good behavior on Wednesday, but she has focused more of her anger at any retaliation for the tariffs than the person starting it. All of this is due to one man. And that's Donald Trump. It's not due to the United States. It really is due to one man who has completely changed American trade policy. And there was a time that Republicans were free traders. They're not anymore because of one man. But Smith's focus is on any potential retaliation. So she's more mad at Doug Ford or Francois Legault, or especially Justin Trudeau. Scott Moe has gone back and forth. He signed the communique, but he hasn't elsewhere. The thing is, she's not necessarily speaking for all of Alberta. She's speaking on behalf of the oil and gas sector. So if I was a canola farmer, if I was a beef rancher, and I'm going to be hit by these tariffs, and they will be hit by these tariffs, who is speaking for them?
So do you think there's going to be any room in this budget to actually strengthen the economies of cities like Calgary so that it's actually in Alberta's benefit?
No, I don't. Interestingly, the federal government, when they're talking about an export tariff, and so the difference between a tariff and an export tax is a tariff is collected by the incoming government. So if I'm a Canadian business and I'm going to sell cattle to the United States, I'm paying a tariff to the U.S. Treasury. I'm then going to increase my costs to cover that tariff on U.S. consumers. An export tax would be if the Canadian government was taxing me on the export of cattle from Alberta to the United States. The Canadian government, both under Trudeau and Poilievre and Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, they've all said this, that they will use that in some sort of compensation program for the jobs affected by that. But it's similar to what we saw with the CERB. When jobs were lost as a result of COVID, they created a compensation program. I'm not hearing any of that language coming out of Alberta. So is that going to be seen as a federal responsibility, or is Alberta going to create a special program for those adversely affected? I haven't seen that or heard that.
Okay, so we'll be looking for that.
Yeah, don't think you'll see it, but it would be something to ask for, or at least to set aside some money for that project.
Okay. Now, we talked a little bit about the Green Line. Let's talk a little bit about the elimination of photo radar. These are decisions that are being made by the provincial government.
Yeah.
And the ultimate responsibility is on our municipality. So decisions are being made that impact us financially. How do you see this moving into the future? Will we see more of this?
Absolutely, you're going to see more of this with this current government. As I said, the previous governments, and that occurred under Kenney or Klein or Notley, with some bluster and with some criticism, but they never actually took these sorts of actions. Stelmach, I remember talking about getting rid of photo radar because that's popular politics to oppose photo radar. But the question is, if you remove that, then there's a revenue gap. And where does that revenue gap go? How is that being covered? And what you're being told is, well, you figure it out. You figure it out. We're going to remove this, but you figure out how to cover those costs. And you can make a policy debate about this. But the way that it was announced by Devin Dreeshen, in a butcher shop with the T-shirts, it was really partisan politics at its finest.
So then how do you reconcile the fact that public safety is now in jeopardy? Because we know the data indicate that collisions have gone down in the areas where there was radar enforcement.
Yeah.
How do you counter those two responsibilities that the provincial government has?
Yeah, and what other tools do you have? Do you simply deploy more officers as opposed to photo radar, right? How do you enforce the laws? That is a problem. That will lead to more collisions, more accidents, more deaths. But that's going to be, again, one of these things where the provincial government does what's politically popular, getting rid of photo radar because drivers don't like photo radar. And then who has to clean it up? Mm-hmm. The city police, city council. So we're seeing a theme, is what I'm saying here. You're right, of removing levers, but giving you the responsibility to do more with less.
And your perspective is that because people don't understand the impacts of offloading by the provincial government, when their property taxes are impacted, they're only blaming the municipal government.
Absolutely. Okay. And that's a good way of stigmatizing and of scapegoating.
And we've seen that over the years. We've seen the cuts that they made to the share that we got of fine revenue, and now they're eliminating that fine revenue.
We see this with orders of government all the time. So we think back to the mid-1990s and the efforts of Chrétien and Martin to balance the budget. Well, they balanced the budget by reducing transfers back to the provinces, right, and let the provinces deal with it. So the federal government got credit for balancing the budget. The pressure was then placed on the province. And so the province is doing something similar to municipalities now. But it's not just that gap between the province and municipalities. It really is, you do need to separate the big cities versus the rest of the province, because there's an electoral base that beating up on Calgary and Edmonton is good politics, which is why they were shocked, a lot of rural municipalities, when Bill 20 came out, because it realized that affected them too. And that's where the pushback came from. They ignore the pushback coming from your office or Calgary councillors, but they're not going to ignore the pushback coming from the rest of the province.
Well, it's interesting because I've said many times, I think this provincial government has done more to unite municipalities in Alberta than they might realize. And so we seem to be fairly unified in our voice as Alberta municipalities. But how do we deliver this message that we need to be working together as a provincial and municipal body? How do we get that message across?
That is very tough because you have different interests at play. And so collaboration requires a common goal. Well, there is no common goal because it's about blame shifting. And so how do you work together when you're trying to blame the other side? And so if you, I'm going to be fascinated to watch the municipal elections in the fall, as I'm sure you are too, and to see how much is campaigning against the provincial government as opposed to campaigning against the other people in office.
I think it's really interesting that right now we both have common interests. As we have heard from the Canadian Chamber, our two most vulnerable sectors are oil and beef.
Yeah.
I have a very active interest in making sure we do everything we can to protect those two sectors because of what they provide to our economy, the jobs that they provide. I have a vested interest in making sure that we are protecting paychecks and people's quality of life. So I would think that they would have a common goal. So shouldn't that be enough of a common goal to work together?
You would think it would be. Often a crisis will bring people together, but I'm not seeing any evidence of that. We do know that if we go into a recession, that's what tariffs would cost Canada. It would hurt the United States as well, but not nearly to the effect that it would hurt us. Calgary is going to be hurt the most. An analyst came out from the Canadian Chamber that the two most vulnerable cities in the country are St. John, New Brunswick, which, okay, is not a very big place, but it is if you're in St. John, and the city of Calgary. We saw that in 2014 and 2015 when the price of oil dropped, and we were hindered for at least 6-7 years. Now you combine that with beef. So we've had crises on beef before. Think of the BSE in 2003, 2004. We've had issues with oil, but this is going to be simultaneous. So
given all of this, and it almost sounds hopeless that we're not going to get the province to understand why we need to collaborate.
Not necessarily, I wouldn't say hopeless. And the reason for that is we're talking about threats. And those threats have already had both an economic impact and a psychological impact, but they haven't hit yet. When they do, is that going to be enough to actually bring people together? That is going to be problematic. And because, you're talking about collaboration within Alberta, you have to look at the wider context that we are going to be thrust into the middle of a federal election. And the Alberta government has a clear preference in that election. And so there is partisan aspects at play just as much as there is a national crisis. And that's the problem. So we have issues between the provincial government and municipal government in Alberta. We have issues between the provincial government and the federal government. And we have the Canadian-U.S. conflict. All of that is occurring at the same time. So it's very complicated and messy. And you have policy areas where you should agree, but those are being blinded by naked self-interest.
And partisanship.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, partisanship and naked self-interest.
Which brings me to the question of the opening of the door for the party system at the municipal level. How do you see that playing out?
You can have a legitimate debate about the value of parties in municipal politics. Montreal has a party system. Vancouver has a party system. They're all kind of slightly different depending on the jurisdiction you are. A lot of U.S. cities have party systems. There are strengths of a party system because it actually weakens the power of incumbency. In a non-party system, incumbents have a huge advantage. That's all fair. We can have that debate, but that's not what this is about. This is really about how to elect more conservatives in Calgary and Edmonton. At the end of the day, they are astounded that you look at the city of Edmonton, in the federal election, no matter who is leading the Liberals, the Conservatives will win most of the seats in the city of Edmonton, and you have a largely progressive city council. Calgary, same sort of thing, heavily conservative federally, and a progressive city council. And that has gone on for decades and decades. And conservatives at the provincial level have railed against that, and this is their effort to elect more conservatives. They are not hiding this fact. They are being explicit about this fact, that the point of a party system and the point of bringing more money in is to elect more conservatives on city council. That's the problem I have, because it divorces itself from a policy debate about parties to what is a tool that we can use. And that's, I think, is a real shame.
And it also brings up the specter of whipping votes and directing people on.
Well, there's a lot of focus on the election and using parties to help signify who to vote for. And not enough analysis about what happens the day after the election and about the governance. Because who's the leader of a party? I have no idea who that leader would be. They're going to say, well, the mayor is the head of the party. Well, what if the mayor's not running on a party platform? Is there an official opposition? Do you have whip votes? And so you look at both in Ottawa and in Edmonton, at the provincial and federal level, how many votes where you see the opposition party voting with the government? Very, very rarely, unless it's some motherhood and apple pie sort of statement. Is that what you want on city council? Yes, there are factions on city council, and you can predict some votes based on those factions. But there's also a lot of fluidity where they move from one side to the other depending on what the issue is. And most people like that fact that you're not entrenched. That's where we're not having enough discussion about what the impact of a party would be in those circumstances. Not about the election, but about the governance after the election.
Let's move over to something that's near and dear to you. You talked about post-secondary at the beginning, and you talked about how it's easy to eliminate funding for those things that not everybody is interested in or not everyone is party to.
Right.
What impacts do you see to our post-secondary system?
So probably the best illustration was in the 2013 budget. There are certain budgets that you remember, the 95 federal budget, for me, the 2013 provincial budget, because out of the blue, we were hit with a massive cut in the grant. And that led to programs being eliminated. That meant class sizes increasing. That meant tuition increases. We saw the same thing when the Notley government came in and they froze tuition for 4 years. But what they did was they provided back funding in lieu of a tuition increase to the universities. That allowed them to continue to function. I think that was a policy mistake by the NDP because it benefited only those students at that moment in time and did not benefit future students. Because sure enough, when the government changed, then they said, your autonomous institutions, you can set any tuition you want to a maximum of 7%. So what did the institutions do? They went to a maximum of 7%. So if you see a drop in the grants, those are the same things that you're going to see. You're going to see programs disappear, and you're going to see class sizes increase. And the target will be much more universities than colleges. And the reason for that is the current government prefers colleges and polytechniques to universities. They think those create real jobs. And there's colleges throughout the province where the universities are concentrated in the cities. And interestingly, when we've seen those cuts before, the University of Alberta has taken the biggest hit. And I think it's because of its location in Edmonton. And that's a real shame.
So at a time when we need to be ensuring that upcoming generations are getting the training they need in the careers that are going to benefit us from a trade perspective, keeping our economy strong, doesn't this seem counterintuitive?
Yes, but there's also a lot of very senior, active members of the Alberta community that are well placed with governments that don't send their kids to Alberta schools. They send them to BC, they send them to Ontario, they send them to the United States. So they're not really interested in that. And the point of, without getting on a soapbox here, the point of post-secondary education isn't necessarily job training for the job today. It is creating a balanced education for the jobs 20 years from now or 25 years from now. I can't predict what a job will be like in 20 years. How can you do that? You create a base of knowledge that will allow people to be able to do whatever skills that they want. But that same sort of centralization of power versus the municipalities, we're also seeing that in post-secondary. We're seeing that in the Alberta Health Services. We're seeing that in AIMCO. That's a common theme right across the board.
So top 3 things you think are going to happen with this budget? The tax cut will be delayed again. There will likely be a deficit projection. I think a conservative deficit projection, because the real effects of the tariffs won't be hit yet. And I think cuts to both post-secondary and municipal grants. So those 4 things. I guess we'll find out in about a week.
In about a week.
Yeah. Thank you, Duane. It's been great to have you on. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody. This was Duane Bratt, Professor of Political Science at MRU.